Well, we had the Transfiguration today, and that's a pretty tough reading. It's actually a difficult reading to take seriously without at least a little personal interpretation getting lost in the mix. So for today, rather than tiptoe around that particular pitfall, I'm just going to dive right in head first and hope there's enough water at the bottom for my dive. Before we get into that, though, we can at least start with one objective observation. Whatever else we may or may not conclude about the Transfiguration, it is certainly a foreshadowing, a sneak peek to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. This passage is a little appetizer for the full reality of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which the disciples will eventually discover and experience directly. But for this reading, well before the death of Jesus, the disciples are understandably confused. So here's where the personal interpretation kind of worms its way in. I can't help but read this passage while keeping in mind the nature of our immortal souls. Jesus Christ is revealing to his three friends, these three disciples, the fact that our bodies made out of meat are not all that we are. Every one of us is absolutely brimming with divine majesty and beauty, and we just can't see each other like that yet. It's like seeing ultraviolet or infrared light with the naked eye. Your eye just can't do that, even though the light is right there in front of you. But you know what? Every so often, someone gets to borrow a pair of divine night vision goggles, and they get to see that infrared light that's right there before them. Every once in a while, someone is lucky enough to see the truth for what it really is. And I use the word lucky because as far as we can tell, there is no pattern about who receives this gift or when or how. Believers and unbelievers alike go through remarkable things in life, and there doesn't seem to be any way for you to increase your chances of witnessing a miracle. But to be as serious as can be, those experiences are quite real. Beyond the fakers and beyond the well-intentioned people who are a little gullible. Because obviously, not all near-death experiences are going to be authentic. Obviously, there are people who will jump to conclusions when a perfectly reasonable explanation is right there before their face. It has always been that way. But to remind you of the words of G.K. Chesterton, a forged banknote does not disprove the Bank of England. If anything, it proves it, because that counterfeit bill is copying something real and valuable. But we don't need to worry about those things. Those false positives, they're a non-issue. We should be focusing on the other cases, the ones that are a little harder to disprove. Because so many ordinary people, perfectly ordinary people, go through extraordinary experiences in life. One relatively common story is a person will die, and they will just appear in the form of a vision or something to their closest loved one, normally a parent or a spouse. And this is, they've died miles away. The hospital hasn't called anyone with the bad news, but they just kind of pop in front of them at the moment of death or very, very quickly after the moment of death, like minutes. And this deceased loved one has a message, and it's almost always basically the same. It is almost always some combination of, I love you, and or, it's okay, don't worry, everything's going to be fine. It's almost always a combination of those two things. It's never the deceased giving their loved one lottery ticket numbers. It's never a banal message like, hey Dad, I died in a car accident tonight, don't forget to pay the gas bill. Like, that doesn't happen, because they always tell the loved one what they need to hear, and people's spiritual needs are basically the same. So it really boils down to, I love you, and don't worry, it's going to be okay. Those stories happen all the time. Maybe not that exact one, that's one example of many, but more people than you think have a story like this, because a lot of people have gone through something like this, and they keep it to themselves because they don't want to be judged and ridiculed as being superstitious or gullible. A lot of people have these stories. If you're interested in something with a little bit more of a scientific flavor to it, there is an excellent book out there called Proof of Heaven by Dr. Eben Alexander, MD. So this guy, the author, was a neurosurgeon, brain surgeon, and he was not religious at all. And one day, he got bacterial meningitis in his brain, and that's usually fatal. That's a very serious thing. That is very difficult to survive. So he fell into a very deep, very serious coma, and he survived thanks to science and modern medicine. Yay doctors, credit where credit is due. Here's the remarkable part of the story, though. Because he is a neurosurgeon, he knew that there was no conventional scientific explanation for what he went through. Because he did have a near-death experience, don't ask me how, he could tell that his family was praying for him. And he writes this as black and white as he can in the book. Because if people don't believe in near-death experiences, their objections are basically one of two things. They either say, A, you were just dreaming it, well-wishing, or B, you were hallucinating, it was a delusion, random neurons firing, your brain is just malfunctioning, but either way, they would say it's all in your head. And this doctor, he said, no, you don't get it. My brain was not malfunctioning, it was turned off. My brain was non-functional. It was not capable of hallucinations or delusions. The only thing that was possible was infinite black nothingness. And that didn't happen. So when he recovered, he really had no choice but to face the fact that we don't merely exist within the confines of the fatty tissue of our gray matter. Some part of us must somehow exist independently of our synaptic network. And it's my only hope that you find that as fascinating as I do. So these stories and more besides, they are the transfiguration. They are the transfiguration told and retold throughout history as a sign to the rest of us that we are more than meets the eye. And I'll remind you, the Star Wars version of this message is not half bad. Yoda to Luke in Empire Strikes Back, luminous beings are we, not this crude matter. I'm going to stop there because I will quote Yoda all day long if I had no willpower. But instead, I want to end with a note of practicality. What should this do for you? And the answer to that is this story should inspire you to live your best life with the good of all in mind. Because this divine majesty that Christ reveals in the story It's within every single one of us here today because we are made in the image of God. It's also present in Buddhist monks on the other side of the world in Tibet because they're made in the image of God too. And people in Norway, and everybody in besides. And yes, you may not want to hear this, it's also there in your worst enemy. That person you can't stand to be around, well, even if their soul is absolutely caked with mortal sin, that divine majesty and beauty is right there within them as surely as it's within you. It cannot be destroyed. It can never be taken away. It's there. So you should live every day of your life as if you're absolutely basking in the love and glory of God, because you absolutely are. Whether you believe in it or not, whether you can see it or not, it is there. It is all around you, and perhaps more importantly, it is within you. And it is not something that is meant to be wasted.